Hello and welcome to Life Beyond the Numbers, the podcast for those curious about creating a more fulfilling work life. Every business boils down to two basics, people and money. Here we focus on the human side. Numbers matter, but people matter most, and people drive performance. I'm Susan Nichriadon, your host, a coach, consultant, facilitator and author of Leading Beyond the Numbers. It brings me joy to speak to people and explore together how, although we share many similarities as humans, each of us navigates the world through our own unique lens. This adds intricacy to our interactions and contributes to both the depth and difficulties of interpersonal relationships. Join us for stories, strategies, and insights to help you lead your life beyond the numbers. Hello and welcome to episode 192 of Life Beyond the Numbers. And this episode is going out on Saturday, December 21st, 2024. And I don't know about you, but if you're based in the same hemisphere as I am, it seems to me that this winter was darker and drearier than any other. And I said that to a friend of mine recently, and she said, my mother says that every year. So maybe that's just a sign of how resilient we all are as humans in one way, because we forget that the winter is dark and dreary every year. And this one seems more so somehow. The wonderful thing about December 21st, 22nd is it's the end of it, isn't it? It's the shortest day and new beginnings are afoot. It'll start to get a bit brighter in the mornings and stay a bit brighter, a bit longer in the afternoon. And I just find that shift into new energy exhilarating. So it's the end of 2024. What a year. There was a lot packed into this year and some changes in life as well. Certainly in Life Beyond the Numbers, because I've reduced the amount of episodes that go out. So Life Beyond the Numbers goes out every 2 weeks now. I'm not really doing solo episodes. Not many. I may do one to welcome in the new year. Let's see. And my book is out in the world, Leading Beyond the Numbers. And thank you to any of you who have purchased it and any of you who have sent me comments about it or left reviews. And if you have read the book and haven't left a review, it would be amazing if you could take a couple of minutes and do that. If you can leave a review on Amazon, or if you'd rather not write anything, you can also just rank it. And all of these reviews really help. Apparently, Amazon reviews are like gold. I think we just need to keep feeding the algorithm. So yes, that would be amazing. Thank you so much. So this week, the last episode of 2024, I have put together a compilation episode. And I did a compilation episode earlier in the year, back in March. So this one covers the period April through December. And it's always interesting to do these compilation episodes and find a theme that ties them together. And the theme that came up for this one was beyond the status quo, hence the title. And I've got clips from 5 different episodes for you to listen to today. The first episode we're going to hear from is episode 176 with Kevin Chevis, and this episode was released in June. And in this clip, Kevin shares a reflection on the trap of short-termism and how stepping back to focus enables us to think about what impacts the business, in this case, or indeed our lives, the most. And it's also about the importance of how we communicate with one another. And I think that's the key phrase there, the longer term. We focus a lot on the results of the next quarter or this year or the relationships now, when actually, if you're in business for the longer term, we plan on longer term, yet we don't treat our businesses as if they're there for the long term, or our relationships either often.
Yeah, I think there's a trap people fall into. You do a plan, you do a next year, and you do the 5-year plan. And the 5-year plan, well, it's difficult. Who knows what we'll be doing in 5 years' time, because things change. Events happen, political initiatives alter. All those things impact your business, which you can't necessarily foresee. So there is always a tendency to focus on the month end and the quarter end, the half year, September, and then the end of the year. And you can get lost in that and forget that these other things are really crucial to success. I always used to get to the end of the year and I used to sit down, not deliberately, but I used to think, yeah, we've got our plan, we've got our budget, we've got this, we've got that. What actually am I going to do in the next 12 months? And of course, there's loads of things. There's hundreds of things you could do. There's hundreds of ways to spend your time. I found it helpful to say, well, what impacts our business the most in a positive or negative way that may or may not even impact the numbers in the next 12 months? And try and find a simple way to write that down. And then I'd have that in my mind and I'd start the year saying, I'm going to focus on these things. Now, of course, you have to focus on your main shareholders' topics, your day-to-day topics. But these other topics are things which can make a real difference. And they often take time to implement and time for the benefit to come back to you. But if you don't focus on these things, then you're just going to try and do the same thing month after month after month. And honestly, my experience has been you don't get very far doing that. And then there's a balance. It was quite interesting. You did some work with us a year or so ago. And one of my topics from my Christmas break was, we make a lot of silly errors which have an impact on all sorts of things, performance with the client, our own satisfaction and pride, our monthly figures, all those sorts of topics. And I felt frustrated. Well, why does this happen? And we did some work with you, and Helen Joy came in to help us during our management days. And we discovered a number of things. And there were two important things that I realized. The first one was about people. And that we spent very little time focusing on how we interact. How do people want to interact? How do they like to interact? What turns them on? What turns them off? What gets them negative? What inspires them? And this was quite an interesting session. And in my own experience working with my CFO at the time, we're quite different people. But we've got the same objective. We want to be successful in a good way. And we want to achieve, and we want to deliver and surpass the plans we put forward and support. But I realized that the way he operated was somewhat different to how I operated. He wanted to spend time with the detail and explain that to me at some length, and I just wanted to get to the end as fast as possible and make a decision. And there were moments where there was tension. It wasn't bad tension, but there was certainly tension. One of the things I learned during that time was I do need to give him some opportunity in a constructive way to let him go through and explain to me what he needs to do, because it's important. It's important to him that I got it. and others in the team and the rest of the company. And it was also important for him to realize that sometimes you can't go through endless detail for hours on end. Sometimes you've got experience, you've got to trust your gut and your instant reaction. You've got to do something, you've got to do it today. And so sort of realizing that even with those two characters, those two roles, I think that was really helpful. And certainly post that exercise, I can't speak for him, but I certainly felt our working relationship became more productive. Because it was less trying to beat the other, it was actually being more collaborative. So that was the first thing that came out. And the second thing that came out, I was frustrated by sometimes things didn't happen in the organization that should have happened. And there was no real reason why they didn't. As a leader, you look into the, you say, well, why? What are we doing wrong? Why is this occurring? And we had a whole series of workshops and ideas put together. And rather than the senior level management team leading those, we let people the next level down lead them. And we said to my team, you can be in each of the groups, but you're not to take it over. And if I remember correctly, the idea was, how can we inspire and work with our management and the next level management down to improve performance, reduce errors, and ultimately improve the financial performance. And one thing that came out, which did surprise me, was the fact that people throughout the organization didn't really get what their contribution was to the organization, because they didn't fully understand what we were trying to do. And I was a bit shocked by that, because I thought, well, I'd like to think I'm a reasonably good communicator. And we did spend time each month having a monthly call with 40 or 50, 60, maybe sometimes 100 people in the organization to say what we were up to, what the plan was, and all that stuff. So you think, yeah, ticking the box. But in actual fact, that has a place, but it wasn't actually effective. And what I actually realized what we were doing was we were giving the management of the company the information that we supply to our main shareholder group. And whilst it has a relevance, it didn't have much context. And what the sort of people said was that some people don't know why what they do is important. And I think this is quite a big topic, actually, because it's not easy to say to everybody in the company, this month, if you do this, it'll be great and we'll achieve the following, because there's just too much detail. But what we started to do is try and find some ways to communicate on a fairly regular basis. Well, these are the key topics that affect what we're doing right now, and try and flow that down in the organization. So it's not for me, for example, to tell everybody, hey, here's the 27 things that make a difference this month. If we do them all, it'll be great. It's actually for the management, next level, all the leaders, whatever level, to make sure they understand the context, because they're closer to everything. They know what's going on much more than I did. They're able to say, hey, this needs to be done right now, or this needs to be stopped, or this needs to be changed. They can then make some decisions and push things however they want to do it and make a real difference. And if somehow we then can recognize that, then you suddenly start to develop a motivated and dynamic workforce.
So Kevin's perspective there sets the scene well, I think, for the next clip, which is from episode 178, A Metaphor for Our Lives, with Alison Smith. And this episode also went out in June. Alison takes us even further, I guess, exploring how shifting our focus, literally and metaphorically, can open up some unexpected directions.
I also say it's about allowing our inner wisdom, that so much we're sort of stuck in the logic, we're stuck in our mind, and there is an inner knowing, there is an inner wisdom, whatever we call that. Some would say that that's the part of us that does talk in metaphors anyway. So we're opening up the dialogue with that part of us that doesn't have words, but enables us to go, I'm walking along a path, I look one way and it's just brambles and no paths and horrible, and I look the other way and there's openness, and you suddenly realize, oh, I'm looking at the brambles all the time. And if all I have to do is turn around and all the paths that I need are not in the direction I'm looking, I just need to change direction. And that's so freeing when you get that insight. I mean, that so often comes up. And on the podcast, what I did for the first series was sort of sit at my desk and do it a bit from historically, this is what's happened. And I got a bit bored. So the second and third series is me going out and embodying uphill struggle. Can't see the wood for the trees. But every episode, there's me getting excited at some point about that. Oh my God, I didn't know that. No. Oh my God, isn't that obvious? I'd never realized that. And that is what happens. We see something. Because we're not just going for a walk, our brain is already, or our mind or our inner wisdom has already said, oh, wow, you're going to notice this. Here's a new acorn, because it's last year's acorn that's still not gone in the ground. But then right next to it is a little sapling of an oak tree. And then right next to it's a big oak tree. And somebody might get something from that. And somebody else might get something from the path.
It's amazing. If you think of our workplaces, we're almost tied to our desks and our computers, and our words that have to be professional or technical or whatever phrase you want, whereas actually the freedom that comes from allowing the mind to wander a little bit and allowing that breakthrough to have the space to come through can actually move mountains, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, and you might not be able to move the mountains out there, but you can if you're drawing them.
Yeah.
So like a vision setting day with a team, because their head office was sort of in the middle of nowhere. And they all went off in different directions. And one team came back and said, oh, we went to the graveyard. And you're thinking, oh my God, I wonder where this is going. And they said, well, somebody was proud enough to put their profession on their gravestone. And we would like that. We would like to be proud of our profession. And it sort of took them into a different place than they had been. The other team went down this country road and it was going to be a dead end. There was grass growing in the middle of the lane. And so somebody turned to somebody and said, oh, we're coming to a dead end. We're in a rut. And they all nodded. And I think that for them, when they came back and told the story, everybody went, yeah, that's how our team within the organisation is feeling. But what then happened, and I wish I'd got somebody to take a picture at the time, is that they spied a hole in the hedge. And so somebody said, well, if we continue the way we're doing, it's a dead end. So we need to go through this hedge. So they're there in their suits, because I hadn't warned them they were going outside. So they pushed through the hole in the hedge, and then they went up the hill, and then they got to the top of the hill, and then they could just see for miles and miles. And it was as if they went from feeling like the organisation was stuck in a rut, we're headed for a dead end, to being able to see for miles. So when they came back with that mindset, and then you got another team adding to it saying, oh, well, we want to be proud of what we do. Between them, they were then able to come up with sort of a more motivating vision for where they were taking the team than previously, because they just had time to allow nature to coach them, really, rather than just do it all in their heads and go, what did we say last time? Yeah, that's what we want.
Yeah, or sit in a meeting room without windows and just get upset and frustrated. And
yeah, that.
Yeah, that. And We hear it so much about how people have their best ideas in the shower or out in a walk, and yet we resist that as a tool, effectively, a free tool. But where's the disconnect, Alison, do you think?
Where my head's gone, I don't know whether it's the reason you asked the question, but where my head's gone is what I talk a lot about is that we leave our humanity at the door of the office. And we sort of put on the stereotype of what we think. I've got a set of cards with words on, sometimes get people to pick the cards at the beginning of the session. How is the word on the card going to be useful for you today? And somebody turned around, they pulled kindness. And they said, oh, I didn't know I could bring kindness with me.
Whoa.
And yeah, I think it's not to underestimate what we think we can't bring into the office with us.
Alison's jaunts into nature and her memorable take on perspective reminds us, I suppose, that clarity often lies just outside our normal frame of view. And from that, Marc, Haine, our third clip, which is from an episode that went out in November, 190, a couple of centimetres of care, tells a great story about Orlando Airport in a heat wave.
Being able to interact with people like you're putting on a show has been the catalyst of my background now, and this is what I talk on forever, because it's all about this idea. And you said you read the first bit of my book. My first chapter is called Experience Expectations, and that's all about understanding what are the touch points in our businesses and how can we look at the touch points and make them extraordinary rather than just the day-to-day transaction.
Our expectations are generally quite low in a lot of our one-on-one interactions in a supermarket or in a train station or in an electronics store. Perhaps different when we're sitting having a meal or on a plane. We have different expectations, but I think they're easily met if there's some intentionality, like you're saying.
Yeah, and all we have to do is just care. Just care, like on an airplane, just care that people are on a plane. It's a routine that most of us don't do very often. So why can't we make that extraordinary? I just found a post on Instagram on the Orlando airport. During the heat wave, there were people in the airport giving out free ice cream. Now, when we think about airports, we're thinking, oh my goodness, I was just at LAX. Oh, it's a terrible airport. Oh, Toronto, Pearson International Airport. Oh my goodness, if I could stay away from Pearson, that would be great, right? We have all these different pictures in our heads about what airports we like to go to and which ones we want to avoid like the plague. But here you have Orlando airports, just because it was a heat wave. I don't know what it cost them. Maybe it's 50 cents per person, but there was somebody handing out ice cream. And so now you have a group of people, travelers inside the airport, all of a sudden getting surprised by this little token that is so minuscule and yet made such a big impact.
It's so true, isn't it? And what you were saying about avoiding places like the plague, it's not the place.
No.
It's the experience that
Exactly.
we had. And it's the people often, unfortunately, that have created that experience.
Yeah.
And we remember, as like you have the Maya Angelou quote in your book, and so do I, we remember how people make us feel.
Yes, absolutely. 100% of the time, 100% of the time. And you might not even remember people's names. You might not even remember the whole context of the experience. You just remember when I went to this one particular thing, I had a great time. Or when I went here, it was terrible. And my wife is always calling me back and saying, oh no, we went to that restaurant 10 years ago. Do you remember how long we had to wait? Oh, I don't want to go back. That was 10 years ago. But that's how ingrained these memories be within our psyche to make sure that we don't hurt like that again.
And isn't it the same in our workplaces as colleagues as well, Marc? That we care for one another.
The big difference, I think, is going from transactional to relational. We have to stop thinking in the way of, okay, I've got this customer, I'm going to serve this customer, now that's done. Next, I have a colleague, he wants something, he's standing in my doorway, okay, as soon as I'm done this, I can get on to my next thing. That's not the way that we interact as human beings naturally. Nature doesn't work that way.
What you're saying there is not rocket science. In fact, it is simple, it's basic. Is that why we overlook it?
It's because, again, we're transactional, we get into the grind, and we forget to care.
Okay, you're going to keep telling me this, aren't you?
I am, because ultimately that's what it boils down to. It's that intentionality. I mean, we've always seen when we felt that somebody cared about what was happening to us, it always made us perk up and take notice. When somebody does an act of kindness, you don't forget that. But at the same token, when somebody does something incivil or cruel, you won't forget that either. The protagonist will, like the aggressor will, forget about it. Like, I forget that you came in and it's like, oh my goodness, are you wearing that to work? And you're like, I took time to pick this out. It's a seagull moment where they come in, they poop on everything, they squawk and fly away. And they don't even remember it.
Yes, that was definitely beyond the status quo. And I think Marc demonstrates the value of caring, of being intentional in our interactions, rather than being transactional. Next, we hear from Liz Jarman. And Liz's episode, Willing to Take Risks, number 187, went out in October. And Liz has a reflection on culture and building high-performing teams. And Liz, you talked about that question that the board member asked you, your mentor, about your legacy. So what is your legacy for Living Goods?
Well, we've evolved a lot as an organization. When I took over, we just got a big influx of funding, but that funding needed match funding. So there was a big pressure to raise a lot of money, but then get a lot of money. So we were scaling really rapidly. So part of, I think, what I have focused on was how do we scale in a sustainable way, and how do we maintain our culture? Which is, I think, quite a unique culture in the not-for-profit world, because a lot of us, myself included, come from the private sector. And so we have a bit of a private sector mindset on how we work, how we focus on return on investment, results, and quick testing and pivoting. We have a lot of what we call unrestricted funding. So it's almost like you develop a business plan and then you fundraise against it rather than do projects that are funded. So that requires a really strong culture. And so I really focused on improving our culture and making sure it stood throughout COVID, but also with rapid scaling. So culture is one area that I'm really proud of. Culture to me includes high-performing teams. I think they go hand in hand. It's not just, oh, it's a nice place to work. It's high-performing teams, but largely driven because it's a great place to work. To get results, you need people to be highly engaged and feel very valued. So I think when I became CEO, I really recognized that I had a responsibility just to bring that to life. When I became CEO and it was announced, and as I said, this was 6+ years ago, and it was a surprise to me as well as the organization. And I had so many emails, mainly from women in my organization, quite junior, saying, I never thought I'd be led by a woman. I'm so impressed that you've been promoted within. It gives me hope for my career. And I was like, oh my goodness, I've got all this responsibility. People are looking up to me. And so I really took that on, and particularly the women thing. I've been very fortunate in my career not having too many barriers. And I thought, wow, especially in the African continent where I was at, this is so critical. So part of what I really wanted to do culture-wise was show up and spend time and be intentional about spending time with the team. And of course, as a planner, that meant I had to really plan to be able to fit that in, because I think the first 6 months, I thought, how am I going to do any of this? I'm just spending time on calls with funders and trying to do this and trying to do that. So I joked, I know exactly when I'm going on holiday every year because I plan. I'm visiting Burkina Faso here, Kenya here, Uganda here, US here. I've got this big meeting, this big meeting. And so for me, it was about really dedicating time to different levels of the organization and doing that in a systematic way so that they knew that 2 or 3 times a year I'm visiting and I'm spending time with these groups of people. And that to me makes a huge difference. And obviously, even during COVID, I then would do it in a virtual type of way. But I think I was also able to bring in some of the private sector investments, like a big organization that Sainsbury's has done, into quite a relatively small organization. And so that was about having a high performing executive team that required making some tough decisions on some people, investing in executive coaching, leadership courses, just really working together and having retreats as teams, as we never did before. I really then started to work on, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, on the level below my executive team, because we need that succession thinking there, and it's tricky. And also the feedback continued to come through. So I did external surveys, we call them voices surveys, every year, and it continued to get feedback about not understanding how decisions were made. So then being very clear that we would have steercos for certain decisions and we'd have a mixture of people, but then introducing something called rapid, which is a way of making decisions. So rapid is about, you have a recommender, you have somebody who agrees to the recommendation, you have input into that recommendation, and then the decision, and then the performance. It's actually harder than it sounds. And even now we're not quite there, but it starts to get the team below to come up with recommendations, be very clear on who they've got input from, who's agreed to it, and proactively thinking who needs to make this decision at what level. And this evolved to also having a much stronger delegation of authority and decision-making frameworks, which we put in place. So a lot of effort on decision-making, both the process, the transparency, and who. Still not perfect, but a lot of work around that. I think the other thing that I invested in, particularly post-COVID, because I think people hadn't been together like in many places, but it was really tough in Uganda as one really tough lockdowns there, is we also tried to do a lot more work on safe spaces to speak up, particularly when you've got a lot of my staff are remote working in quite rural areas. And we've had this facilitator who's really supported having uncomfortable conversations. And that exercise of psychological safety and having those conversations. And I've been in a room and seen things put on the board, which is horrendous. And my leaders around me, I've said, look, I could take that and say, I want to resign tomorrow because it's failed. Or I can say, wow, thank goodness people are willing to say that. And what can we do about it? So trying to lead by example, being present, but having a lot of these frameworks in place has been really important.
Liz doesn't settle for status quo either, does she? And I think what I really like about this is the impact of demonstrating how everyone's voice matters, and that acting on what people say is what counts. And she also introduces the whole concept of psychological safety, which sets us up really nicely for the last clip with Helen Joy. And this is from episode 170. It went out way back in April. And this episode was called Leaping Forward, which is a wonderful way to think about how you might challenge your own status quo going into 2025. The link between innovation and psychological safety, is that something that people are aware of? I'm just thinking back to a job I had, and that's what's coming into my head now. As I was in this organization that was, even though my team, there was psychological safety in it for sure, from the leadership side of things, there just wasn't. It was a very psychologically unsafe environment, and yet we were always getting together to be innovative. And It never worked, funnily enough. But it's like a catch-22. When you're not in a psychologically safe environment, you cannot explain to leadership why there's no innovation. So it's chicken and egg or catch-22. What do you do in that situation?
If you are responsible for that department, you're responsible for the psychological safety. And that's where you've got to start. If that innovation is not happening, you've got to absolutely understand why. That might, if there's no psychological safety, that might be really hard to do, because nobody is going to tell you the brutal, honest truth for fear of the punishment, the judgment, the ridicule, all of those things. So where you've got to start, you've got to go right back to the beginning then, and you've got to nurture those relationships one-on-one and create that trust so that you can build on top of that trust, that psychological safety. And the only way you can do that is by creating situations where you can prove and evidence your trustworthiness. And that will be different for everybody. And that takes time. And that's the problem you get sometimes in organizations, is the people who are put into those positions to do that are not given the time to create the environment where people can feel psychologically safe, so they can even tell you that's been the problem or where the problem actually is. Because sometimes it can be one individual in a team that can completely undermine and ruin everything. As a leader in there, you should be able to spot that. If you sit in a room and you are watching these people interact with each other, and you're watching who's doing the talking, who's obviously got things they want to say but they don't, looking at the different ways that those ideas are brought into that room. For a start, is it the case that everyone writes their ideas down and somebody else is responsible for them and people don't have to own up to the ideas? But it's observing what is happening, identifying the behaviours that are undermining that psychological safety, and dealing with that first and foremost, because it doesn't matter how well you build these relationships, if that behaviour is still enabled and allowed, people will never get beyond that, and then they'll walk because they'll go, well, I told you that that was the problem. And that's the challenge, is that if you don't have the time to do that, or you don't deal with the problem straight away, you will never create the psychological safety you need to create the innovation for your team to continue to do what it needs to do. And what will happen is you get a churn of leaders who go through the same process.
And that reminds me of an organization where one of the leaders in the organization, that team did not have psychological safety at all. But that team leader, director, was bringing in lots of clients. So they were able to bring in the money, and therefore nobody wanted to do anything about that particular person. But then you just had complete turnaround of staff because no one wants to stay working there.
Yeah.
So and you're leaving a lot of value, I think, unrealized value, and really all you're going to do is churn out crap when you could actually really change the world.
Yeah. Oh, you know, when I worked in recruitment, there was one particular team, one office that had a salesperson who was billing probably £250,000 a year. So that's quite a lot of money for one individual. But they were toxic, and they stole all the great clients, and they lied, and they trampled all over their colleagues and their teammates, had no respect for anyone else, and really thought they were the big I am, because they had been lauded and applauded for years for being amazing. And they got a new manager because nobody else in the team could bill more than £60,000 a year, which is not enough in that environment in a big city. And when they got this new manager in, they spent that time, they observed and they saw the behaviours, and they spent time getting to know the rest of the team and recognising what they could bring, what they had, why they didn't perform to the levels they should be doing. They'd spotted that this person was the problem, but the feedback eventually started to come through that actually these were some of the backhanded sly things they were doing. And they started the process to manage the performance of this individual, not on results, but on behaviours. And they got a lot of pushback from a senior level. Well, what are you doing if you lose them? But they'd had this massive churn in the rest of the team. Nobody got past 9 months. This person was like, well, I've been told I've got to do what I've got to do to get this. And this person eventually left because they didn't understand that their behaviours were wrong. They didn't understand the impact they were having on the rest of the team. They felt that everything they were doing was right because they thought about themselves. And they eventually left because they didn't feel valued and they went off somewhere else. And within 6 months, the performance levels of the rest of that team had obliterated that £250,000 that that one individual was bringing in. And it was an environment and a team that everybody wanted to join. And the feedback they started getting from the clients from this person as well, which was, well, we absolutely hated him, but he found us the right candidates. And certainly in sales environments, that kind of behaviour still is, people can't see beyond the money and can't see. This is it. They can't see beyond the numbers attached to that person's head, and they don't see the potential. It's exactly as you said, the money they're leaving on the table.
I just love how Helen brings in seeing beyond the numbers right there at the end. That was the compilation episode about going beyond the status quo. And as I said, we'd heard from Kevin Chevis, Alison Smith, Marc Haine, Liz Jarman, and Helen Joy. And all of those episodes are referenced in the show notes and are still available to listen to, as are the 191 other episodes. I started this podcast in September 2020 and I had no idea what it was going to morph into. And for any of you who have been listening since then, thank you. I appreciate that you keep coming back and listening to more. And for any of you that have joined us along the way, thank you for joining. I always love to hear what people have to say about the episodes, and it's brilliant to get notes from people every now and then, so I really appreciate that. So to end 2024 and to look forward into 2025, is it time for you to challenge your status quo? What might that look like if you were to go beyond the status quo? Let me know. Thank you for joining me today on Life Beyond the Numbers. If something in this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, please take a moment to leave a review. It helps others like us discover this podcast and join in our conversation. Until next time, keep exploring the human side of work life.